Hi, everybody, and I see some familiar names and faces in the list of folks who were here, so thank you for coming today. As I said, I'm Kathy Hunting, a Marin Master Gardener, and with me is Barbara Robertson, also a Marin Master Gardener, and Barbara is really the author of this talk. She did the research to put together this two-part presentation on climate smart gardening, and part one covered impacts and mitigation strategies, and part two, which we're giving today, focuses on adaptation to climate change in the context of our gardens, in home gardens. I'd really like to thank Linda Aldrich and the Civic Center Library for sponsoring this talk, and in fact the Marin County Free Library has been a great partner to Marin Master Gardeners in our educational outreach. So let me just say a couple of words about logistics today. We're going to be taking questions via chat, and Barbara Robertson's going to be fielding questions, and we'll pause a couple of times during the talk for clarifying questions. And then questions that are a little bit, perhaps a little deeper, we'll save for some Q&A time at the end. So that's how we'll work. And Barbara may be able to actually answer some of your questions via chat as we go. Please remember to keep yourself muted unless we get to the end and you're asking questions. And hopefully everybody can hear this. But if you are unable to hear the presentation, you can explore which speaker is the correct one by going into the tiny up arrow next to that mute button, next to your microphone icon in the lower left. And you can always try exiting and rejoining the meeting if you're having any issues with feedback or echoes, because it could be your connection. So I'm going to take it away and start by telling you just a little bit, for those of you who don't know, what the Marin Master Gardeners do. We're trained volunteers. We go through a 18-week intensive training program, and our goal is to learn enough so that we can then begin to share knowledge and skills with the public. And we are partners with the University of California Cooperative Extension, and what we focus on is research-based information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable landscape practices. So there's more than 300 Marin Master Gardeners, and we're involved in many different kinds of projects throughout the county. And I'll talk about a couple of those as we go today. So the focus of this talk is on adapting our gardens to climate change. And I'm going to start by defining a couple of terms for you. And I want to make sure, I think everybody probably has a pretty good understanding of what climate change is, but I'm going to start there with a really basic definition and tell you that climate change is the warming of the Earth's atmosphere that has been occurring since around the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s. It started very, very gradually and has been picking up steam in the last 20 or 30 years or so. And it is mostly measured by, there's a lot of different indicators, but it's mostly measured by the metric of the atmospheric temperature. So that's climate change. Adaptation, you know what that is in your regular life, but in the context of climate change, what adaptation means is that we know that climate change has already altered the conditions in our gardening environment, and that the impacts are going to be even more severe in the future. And so what adaptation means in the context of climate change is that we need to change our practices and change our gardening environment so that we may have successful gardens in the face of our changing climate. So it says, we know that it's already here, and we know that there's more environmental impacts of climate change coming down the pike, and we need to prepare for those changes, adapt to those changes so that we can be successful. So that's adaptation. And adaptation goes actually hand in hand with mitigation, which in the context of climate change means adopting practices that actually result in decreased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases that primarily come from the burning of fossil fuels. And so there's lots of different ways that we can adopt strategies in our gardens that will draw down, will help there be less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere so that we're actually contributing to part of the solution. Part one of this talk, and I know some of you were able to attend, and if you weren't able to attend part one, that's okay too. It's not a prerequisite necessarily for this talk, but I want to give you just a little bit of review of the 4 primary environmental impacts of climate change that impact us as home gardeners. And impact number 1 is rising temperatures. I also want to say that climate change is a really big topic. It can be an overwhelming topic. We're going to try to make it a little less overwhelming today by restricting ourselves to the garden relevant aspects of climate change. And we're also going to make it a little less overwhelming by staying local. We're going to stay in the Bay Area and talk about impacts that are felt right here in our local area, and we're going to keep it in the garden. We're not going to talk about all of the major impacts of climate change that are not relevant to the garden. So impact number 1, rising temperatures. We know that since around 1990, actually since around the middle of the last century, we've already had a temperature increase of a couple of degrees here in the Bay Area. And what the climate models are telling us is that in the next 30 years, by the middle of this century, we're likely to see another 2 to 3 degrees of temperature increase here in the Bay Area. And that, of course, has a little variation depending on if you're inland or right by the coast. We're a little bit lucky in Marin in that we're moderated just a bit by the ocean. But in general, we've already seen temperature increases, and the temperature increases we expect in the next 30 years are going to be more than what we've already seen so far. The second environmental impact of climate change that's super relevant to us as gardeners is effects on our rainfall. The climate scientists don't expect that we're going to see big differences in our average rainfall over the next years. The trend is going to be relatively flat, but what we're going to be seeing is more extremes. We're going to be seeing more years where there's drought, more years where there's flooding. And so we already live in a drought, in a kind of summer drought climate, and we're going to be seeing more years when we have to contend with less than average rainfall. And then we're going to be seeing some winter storms that are quite extreme, that bring the risk of flooding. And one of the hallmarks of climate change is that the physical systems that exist in our atmosphere, in our seas, and on our land, those systems are getting less stable. And that is leading to kind of climate chaos. And one manifestation of that is the extreme precipitation times that we're going to be experiencing over the next few decades. And so we may be seeing the same average rain through the year, but with much less predictable timing of when that rain occurs. A third environmental impact of climate change is that ecosystems are being altered by the changing climate. And that manifests first in terms of plant communities no longer being able to be healthy in the climates they've currently inherited or inhabited. And as the climate warms, some plants are going to be unable to continue to thrive and survive in that climate. So some plant ecosystems will migrate along with the changing temperatures and rainfall, and others really won't survive very well at all. Along with the plant ecosystems being impacted, we will also be seeing changes in the insect communities that live kind of in sync with our plant communities. That can include beneficial insects, that can include pest insects. And so they are part of the biodiverse ecosystems that plant communities support. And so those changing insect communities will go along with the ecosystem changes. Same thing for other kinds of wildlife. So other pollinating birds and bats, things like that. The last really important change is that soil is being altered in response to climate change. You are all probably aware that soil itself is a really complex ecosystem, and increased temperatures and precipitation extremes can really mess with the soil structure. They can affect the nutrient availability in the soil, and they can also change the webs of fungus and other microorganisms and small insects and such that live in the soil. And so that soil, if we're not able to change our practices, is not going to be able to support our plants as well. So these are the four important aspects, environmental impacts of climate change that you should keep in mind as we now talk about how to adapt to those changes. I've got a square up here on this slide showing the 5 areas of mitigation practices that I talked about in part 1. If you're curious about learning more about that, you can refer to the YouTube recording of part 1 of this talk. So let's talk about adaptation. What can we do to be successful gardeners despite these significant environmental impacts of climate change? And here's where we're going to stop with the doom and gloom, mostly. And we're going to talk about positive practices that we can put in place that help us be successful in our garden despite climate change. And I'm going to talk about these one at a time. So the first thing that we do, that in fact, when we learn to be master gardeners, one of the first things that we learn to do is how to do a baseline assessment of our garden's characteristics. And here we're looking at what's our climate, what what kind of climate zone do we live in, and what are the characteristics of our microclimate? And do you have, you know, shade all day, or do you have sun all day, or something in between? What kind of soil do you have? What kind of plant communities is your garden best suited to? What are your water systems like? What is your hardscape like? Your, you know, your patios and decks and other kinds of, you know, non-soil, non-plant aspects of your environment where your garden is. And so we need to think about, in order to successfully adapt our practices, we need to understand whether our baseline practices are best suited to our garden. So we start there. You can test your soil and look and see what kind of soil you have, and then think about how you might need to amend that soil. I want to point out this figure at the top of the slide. This is showing the change in frost-free days, essentially the length of the frost-free season, and how has that changed since the first half of the last century. And you can see here that the Southwest US on average has had an increase of about 19 days in our frost-free season. And that might sound good to some people. It means you may have more flexibility with what you can grow. It also, though, think about the frost-free season is focusing on kind of temperatures at our low end. It's focusing on, you know, when the temperature gets above freezing. But think about the other end of that scale, and we're seeing corresponding increases in the number of hot days. And so a longer frost-free season may allow us to plant earlier in the spring, but also it may also mean that we've got more heat to deal with and we do have more heat to deal with in our gardens. Okay, the kind of underneath it all, and it's kind of a metaphor, but really underneath it all is our soil. And it's really probably the most important thing to work on in your garden is to improve and protect the soil. Soil holds carbon or organic matter. It stores water. And because soil has the ability to hold organic matter, that makes soil a storage sink for carbon from the atmosphere. And so healthy soil that has a good capacity to grow plants and be productive is also a soil that is able to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and lock it up under our feet. So how do we do that? How do we make our soil healthy? Well, number one, we increase the amount of organic matter in our soil by enriching it with compost or other organic kinds of soil amendments. When we lay organic mulch on the surface of the soil, and that can be compost or it can be other organic materials, those slowly break down and result in more organic matter in the soil. And both of those help the soil be more productive and keep more carbon out of the atmosphere. But adding organic matter to the soil through composting and mulching is also a climate change adaptation strategy. So locking up carbon is a mitigation strategy, but it's also an adaptation strategy because in a warming climate, water is scarce. Soil is drying out faster with higher temperatures. And when you put more compost, more organic matter in the soil, and you put mulch on top of the soil, it helps the soil retain its moisture. It prevents the soil from eroding. And all of those things are going to help us garden successfully in a warming climate. We can also, especially if we're edibles gardeners, if we're vegetable gardeners, we can plant crops between our seasons. If you have some beds that you don't have plants in year round, you can plant a cover crop. That keeps the soil covered, it keeps the soil from eroding, and it also, if you plant a cover crop that is a legume, then it helps the soil store nitrogen. And that also helps reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because we don't have to add nitrogen in, by way of fertilizers. So I just planted, it's the time of year actually for planting cover crops. I just planted my cover crops of red clover and fava beans last week. So it's the perfect time, if you're a vegetable gardener, to plant a cover crop, to cover your soil through the winter, when we're likely to get some flooding that will wash away some soil. If you live in a place where your soil has a lot of clay in it, you may be subject to some drainage problems in the winter when we get those big atmospheric river storms and we get several inches of rain in a short period of time. And so if that's your situation, you're going to want to work on your drainage. And interestingly enough, compost is another key to improving your soil's drainage. It can help in so many different ways. I have a very robust clay layer in my garden, and there are areas where my plants do get soggy feet in the winter. So I need to figure out strategies to work with that. One more strategy for improving and protecting the soil is to reduce what we call tillage, that is stirring up and crumbling down the soil. You want to be able to help the soil retain its big structure with the microorganism communities that live in that soil staying relatively intact. So no-till agriculture is something you might have heard of lately in kind of not in the home gardening context, but in agriculture context. But we can do that practice as well as home gardeners. So reducing the amount that you break up your soil is a good practice is a climate smart practice. Barbara, are there any clarifying questions so far? No? Okay.
None right now.
Okay, great, thanks. Then I'm going to go on to something that's really front and center right now. Unfortunately, California is on fire, and this is a direct impact of climate change. As the temperature becomes warmer, even though our average precipitation may not change that much, but as the temperature becomes warmer, that means our dry season is going to become longer. The spring rains keep the soil moist, and the moisture in the plants intact for some amount of time after the rainy season is over. But once that moisture draws down, the rest of our dry season is no rain until, usually mid-October, usually really no significant rain until sometime in November, usually. And so it is critically important, as fire risk seems to grow year by year in response to climate change. It is critically important that we practice fire smart landscaping practices in our own landscapes. And so the most important principles are to think about the zones around your house. And in the really close zone, like the first 5 feet of your house, the fire experts suggest using hardscape, that is, you know, paving or gravel or things like that, or low growing, like ground cover that's well watered, herbaceous plants. And from 5 to 10 feet out, to keep plants and shrubs low, not to plant trees or big shrubs out within 10 feet of your house. Once you get out farther than that, you can plant larger plants, trees and shrubs and perennials and annuals, as long as you keep the spacing safe. And we think about, in fire smart landscaping, we think about fire ladders. That is, do you have a big rosemary bush that kind of sits underneath a tree with branches that hang down at about your eye level? Well, that rosemary bush sitting at about maybe, you know, hip level, maybe 2.5 feet high, my hip anyway, that rosemary could catch on fire and spread flames up into your tree with branches hanging down at about 5 feet. That could spread it to another tree. So you need to think about what's contiguous in your garden. Do you have tall grasses that haven't been mowed? Well, they should be mowed so they can't spread fire to the shrubs. So we need to think about vertical and horizontal spacing around shrubs and trees. And the other thing to think about is, where is there dry fuel that might catch on fire if it gets a spark? And sometimes we have dry fuel when we have like the insides of junipers or the insides of, you know, some trees that get really woody. They look good on the outside, but in the inside they're a mess. And so thinking about how can we remove some of that flammable fuel from inside around our trees and shrubs. And of course, removing other dead wood as well. Just a little guidance on mulch. Mulch really varies in how flammable it is. And of course, there are some kinds of mulch like gravel and rocks that are not combustible at all. But mulch that's made out of bark or other organic materials is going to burn. And depending on its surface area, some mulch burns better than others. Like that really stringy gorilla hair mulch is very, very flammable because of all its surface area. Bark nuggets are not as combustible, with kind of bigger chunky bark being less flammable than little chunky bark. So it all has to do with kind of the surface area of the mulch you're using. The farther out you go from the house, the more comfortable you can be with mulch, but you ought to keep the mulch to just a couple of inches, and don't use the most don't use that really stringy gorilla hair mulch at all, unless you're really far out from any kind of structure. Okay, the next strategy for adapting to climate change is to manage our water. Now, if you heard part 1, you heard me say that conserving water is a climate change mitigation practice because it takes a ton of energy to produce clean water and transport it in our water distribution systems. And so if we conserve water, we're saving energy and we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions by doing that. But managing water is also a climate adaptation strategy. And the reason for this is similar to something I just mentioned, and that is, you know, we live in a summer drought climate. We live in places where sorry about the phone, hopefully my husband will answer it quickly. We live in a place where water can be scarce, and it can be especially scarce in drought years. And so if we, sorry, I'm just gonna wait a second. Okay. So we have a scarce resource that's getting more scarce in the face of climate change. And so if we conserve water, we are adapting to climate change. So how do we do that? We plant our plants with similar water needs close to each other in similar what we call hydrozones. And the hydrozone is the area that's being served by one valve on your irrigation system. So the frequency of watering on that valve should be suitable for all the plants that are being reached by that part of your irrigation system. So that's one way to use water wisely. Another way to use water wisely is to choose plants that are drought resistant. And that's pretty obvious, I think, to most of us. We know we live in a climate that is dry, first of all, for 6, 7, some 8 months of the year. But we also know that we're subject to drought years, where we might even be more dry than usual. And so choosing plants that are drought resistant is an obvious climate change adaptation strategy. Watering wisely is another really important thing. And what we emphasize as master gardeners is watering slowly and deeply. So you may not want to water as frequently, but when you do water for a long enough time that the water has a chance to percolate down to where the main root zones of your plants are. And if you're growing annuals, that may not be very deep. If you're watering trees, you want that water to percolate when you water down to about 6 to 12 inches is where the main roots are below the surface for most big shrubs and trees. And so watering deeply, when you do water, using either drip or irrigation or soaker hoses, which are the most efficient ways of watering, are really good strategies for adapting to climate change. It's going to get the water to the roots, encourage strong root development, deep root development, that the roots can go where the water is, and the soil stays more moist down there than it is right up near the surface. Another thing to do is to apply compost, like I said, to help the soil retain more water for longer, and apply mulch on the top to help the soil keep the moisture in that you're putting in there. Another strategy for water-wise gardening is to harvest your rainwater. And some of us have barrels, some of us have even installed, big tanks. But whatever kind of fits your gardening style and your budget, any kind of rainwater you can harvest is good. It means you're not using potable water from our water system to water your plants. And then another strategy actually is a gardening, is a type of garden. You can actually install rain gardens, or what are called bioswales. So what's a rain garden? I had to kind of review the difference between what's a rain garden and what's a bioswale. A rain garden is a low spot in your landscaping where the soil tends to stay moist. And not everybody has a spot like that. But if you do, that's a great place to put plants that love a little bit more moisture. You'll be growing plants is always the strategy for taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So you're growing plants, but you're also slowing down runoff. You're helping the water to percolate into the ground table, which is where we want it to go. We don't want it to run off into surface waters. A bioswale is simply a vegetated channel that leads to the low spot in your landscape, that leads to the rain garden. And because when you vegetate it, it helps slow down the runoff. So that's a good thing too. And we also decrease runoff with permeable hardscapes by using, gravel and spaced out pavers rather than solid concrete, etc. So anything we can get to restore the rain we do get back into our water table is really important. There are some areas of our state that have severe problems with groundwater tables, and we're not one of those areas right here in Marin, but we always want to see our water permeate into the soil as much as we can. I wanted to tell you about a service that Master Gardeners provide, which is called our Garden Walks program. This is the only program that we offer where you can actually get Master Gardeners to come to your garden. If you request a garden walk, 2 Master Gardeners will come to your garden and they'll walk with you through your garden. They'll help you inspect if you have an irrigation system, they'll help you inspect your system, and they'll talk with you about efficient watering, about healthy soil, and about plants that are appropriate for our climate and for your garden your garden environment. And so this is a wonderful service that Master Gardeners offer, and you can call our help desk to schedule a garden walk. So the next section of this talk focuses on selecting helpful plants, and there are a number of different categories of what we call helpful plants for climate smart gardening, as you see here. And so I'm going to go through these one at a time, and I want to start by saying that a healthy plant is more resilient to climate disruptions. And so what we're thinking about in choosing helpful plants is plants that are going to be healthy in the place, in the environment, and the conditions where we're going to plant them. So first, we want to choose plants that handle our climate, which is a dry summer, wet winter climate. We live in a Mediterranean climate, as do a handful of other locations around the world. The Mediterranean basin, the Chilean coast in South America, the coast of Australia, and the coast of and South Africa, essentially. So those are the other Mediterranean climate areas in the world, and if we choose plants from those climates, those plants are also usually going to thrive here. The better choice, even than Mediterranean plants, is to choose California native plants, and California natives that are adapted to the particular type of landscape that you are living in or gardening in. Native plants are superior because, number one, they're closely adapted to our home situation. Number two, they support our native insect and native wildlife communities. And so with the goal of supporting biodiversity, a native plant garden can be really fundamental in helping to strengthen the biodiversity of our landscapes. And so that is a really significant goal in the face of threats to that biodiversity that are coming in from climate change. I wanted to say a word about succulents. I know I like succulents, and I know quite a few people who are crazy about succulents, but we do live in a climate that gets frost. Not everywhere in Marin. If you're lucky enough to be kind of in southern Marin, like Sausalito, more places down there near the water, you may not get frost. But where I am in Point Reyes Station, and where many of you are, we do get frost in the winter. And so as you're choosing your succulents, because they're drought tolerant, make sure that they are going to be able to handle the kind of frost you expect in your microclimate. And you can create little microclimates, little protected areas in your landscape that if you are susceptible to frost, you're going to just choose the kind of the least susceptible places to put any succulents that are sensitive to freezing temperatures. The other thing that most succulents don't like is they don't like soggy soil in the winter. And so if you are going to plant succulents, and if you do have a robust clay soil like I do, you're going to want to you're going to want to dig in a lot of lava rock and improve the drainage in the area where you are planting those succulents. And that is a whole nother talk that I will leave to the master gardeners among us who are experts on that. Harvey's Garden in Tiburon and Falkirk Demonstration Garden are two master gardener demonstration gardens where you can see a large variety of native and Mediterranean climate plants to get ideas for your own garden. And this is a photo that was taken in Blackie's pasture, or what we call Harvey's Garden, showing the founder, Harvey Rogers. The second category of helpful plants is supporting our pollinators. Our pollinators are under threat, not only from climate change, but from a lot of other kind of environmental insults and pest problems. And so it's important because much of our food system in the US and worldwide rests on the work that pollinators do. And they're threatened, and we need to support them as much as we can in our landscapes. And we do that with our plant choices. We do that by choosing flowering plants that are going to offer nectar to our native pollinators, to our bees, butterflies, bats, even some birds. Some plants have leaves that are needed by the hatching butterfly larva, and milkweed, of course, is one of the main examples of that, planting milkweed for monarchs. Native plants are especially beneficial because they have, the pollinators have in many cases evolved hand in hand with the native plants. And so our native plants support often our native pollinators. One of the things that we try to do when we're gardening for pollinators is to choose a wide variety of flowering plants that will flower throughout the entire growing season. Through about those 9 months that most pollinators are active, we want to have we want to have plenty for them to eat. We want to have a diverse selection of different flowers for them to shop at. And so think about blooming through the seasons. We already do that because we want to have beautiful gardens. We're lucky enough to live in this kind of year-round gardening climate, and so we'd already like to do that, but it's even more important for the pollinators. And this last point here on the slide, grouping similar plant species for efficiency, what that means, it's not for our efficiency as gardeners, it's for the efficiency of the foraging butterflies and bees and other pollinators. If you have, instead of spacing out your asters you know, a little clump here and a little clump over there and another clump over here. If you put like a big 3 or 4 foot swath of asters or whichever flowering plant, that means your bees can kind of do one-stop shopping. They don't have to go to a lot of different places when they're foraging to get their nectar and pollen hit. Finally, I want to just mention that another way to be climate friendly and also support pollinators is to minimize or eliminate the use of pesticides, preferably eliminate the use of synthetic pesticides, because particular pesticides are toxic and have been shown to decrease the health of bees in particular, and some butterflies, as monarchs as well, some butterflies. And the reason that this is a climate smart strategy is that pesticides, synthetic pesticides, take fossil fuels to produce. So we want to minimize the reduce of any product that is reliant as an input on fossil fuels, not to mention the transport. So, any questions, Barbara? You're muted.
We have 3 very interesting questions, so hold on.
Okay.
I'll go grab them. First of all, can we, those of us with flower gardens, also plant red clover between bushes, etc.? This is from Harriet.
That's a fantastic idea, because the red clover is doing 2 different things. It's adding nitrogen to the soil, and it's producing flowers that attract the pollinators. So that's a wonderful climate smart strategy, Harriet. Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay, here's another one. Do you recommend a specific hose, like a Supra hose?
I don't have any recommendations on hose. Sorry.
Yeah.
And as master gardeners, we're restricted really from recommending specific products. So I would say, you know, ask around, ask friends, ask your nursery center.
Okay. And third, a really good one from Alyssa. If I'm scattering wildflower seeds this fall, should the area also have mulch? And if so, what type would be desirable?
Wow. Okay. I would follow directions on your seed packet. Most wildflower mixes that I've seen say to cover with like maybe a 1/4 inch of soil. So you could cover with a 1/4 inch of compost, and that would be fine. But I wouldn't. Many seeds need light to germinate. And if your seed packet says don't cover it by much, then you're not going to want to cover it by mulch with mulch until the spring, when things have germinated. You could put down a really thin layer of straw as a mulch, or compost, but you're not going to want to put a heavy mulch down because you won't get good germination. Okay, thanks for those questions. Let's go on to trees and shrubs. So all plants absorb CO2 from the air, and by the magic of photosynthesis, convert that carbon dioxide into plant tissues. So that means that any plant is good for reducing climate change, because it's just every little plant is a carbon storage mechanism, and plants store carbon not only in their kind of what we see above ground, but even more carbon in their roots, and they help the soil store carbon as well. We can maximize that principle by thinking about planting trees and shrubs, because the bigger the plant and the longer it lives, the more carbon it is going to be able to store. So if your goal is to choose plants for your landscape that are gonna have the biggest impact on climate change, on reducing climate change, you're going to want to pick fat, large plants that live a long time and that grow relatively quickly. So that's one strategy for climate change, for climate smart gardening. Another strategy that I already mentioned is that the native trees and shrubs would be the very best choice of all because of the benefits of native plants that I just talked about a few minutes ago. So helping support a native, biodiverse native ecosystem with native trees and shrubs. Another kind of category of trees and shrubs to think about are ones that give us food. So we can think about planting fruit trees and berry bushes to provide us with local food grown right on our own landscape that doesn't take any fossil fuel to transport, to process, transport, and sell in a supermarket. When choosing trees and shrubs that are going to live quite a long time, we need to not only think about what our current climate is in our landscape, but we're going to want to think about what that climate is going to be like in 20, 30, 40 years for long-lived plants. And we already know that it's going to be warmer in 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so to get a sense of what is going to thrive best in the long run, we probably want to look to a climate zone that is just a little bit warmer than our current climate zone. And here in Marin, that's usually someplace a little bit inland from us, although it could be a place a little bit south of us, or sometimes even a little bit, we might look to, say, inland Sonoma County or something like that. So think about where it's just a little bit warmer, 2, 3, 4 degrees warmer than you are now, and that's going to be a plant that thrives there is likely to be able to withstand the temperature increase in the place where you're living now. So don't think about think about the next climate zone over in choosing a long-lived plant. This is my personal favorite because I'm an enthusiastic edibles grower, but there are many climate change impacts that are going to make it more challenging to grow our own food in the face of climate change. I already mentioned that we have more frost-free days. That is, we have a longer growing season. That could be good if you want to start your crops early, because the air and the soil are warming up a little bit earlier. That may not be your motivation, though, for planting earlier. Your motivation for planting earlier might be to get your crop in before, the really, really hot days that tend to come at the end of August and into September, where we are. And so you may need to think about, okay, how can I get my crop in and not have it burn up in the heat waves that come? Like Labor Day weekend wreaked havoc. Those of you who have vegetable gardens saw a lot of things, saw your tomatoes and maybe your zucchini, your squashes and cucumbers sunburn during that kind of Labor Day weekend heat wave. We need to think about some drought tolerant and heat tolerant varieties of the vegetables that we're planting. We need to think about the fact that we're going to get less coastal fog. In fact, the evidence says that we've got about 3 hours less fog than Marin than the northern coast of California did 100 years ago, which is just an enormous change in our climate in terms of fog. We need to think about the fact that as temperatures warm, we're going to get more generations probably of pest seeds each year, because increased temperatures speeds up most biological processes. So it might become even more important to scatter plants that attract beneficial insects throughout your vegetable garden, to plant some flowering herbs, to plant marigolds or calendula, whatever is going to attract those beneficial insects. And we've got quite a lot of resources on our Master Gardener website that will help you choose plants that attract beneficial insects. So sprinkling those throughout your garden in order to support the beneficial insects that are going to prey on the more numerous pests. If we are growing fruit trees, we may need to choose varieties that require fewer chilling hours. Most fruit trees, some of you probably know, require a certain number of hours of cold temperatures throughout the winter in order to properly break dormancy once spring comes. And so we want to think about the varieties that are going to thrive in our warmer climate. And another thing you can do to kind of lower the water footprint of your edibles garden is to use some perennial plants. In addition to, most of our vegetables are annuals, but we can plant things like artichokes and rhubarb and asparagus that tend to need less water. Once they're established, they have deep roots, they're going to not need watering as frequently as our other vegetable annuals. So that is a climate smart solution for a food gardener. So those are some of the strategies that will help us adapt our edibles gardens for a warmer climate with less predictable rain. I already mentioned cover crops that do so many things for the soil in an edibles garden. They sequester carbon, add nitrogen to the soil, help the soil conserve moisture, they prevent erosion, and they suppress weeds. And so this was just a reminder to say that again. And this is an illustration. This is actually me. I'm turning in my red clover crop by taking large shovelfuls of intact, big shovelfuls of soil and just dumping it over upside down so I don't disturb the soil too much. I'm not crumbling up the soil, tilling the soil. I'm just turning it in big old clumps to try to preserve as much soil structure as I can. Another really important thing to do in the context of climate change is to really have a laser focus on eliminating invasive plants. The reason for this is that invasives are invasive because they are environmentally flexible. Invasive plants tend to be able to tolerate temperature changes and water changes and even changes in carbon dioxide in the air will make some invasive plants thrive more than native plants, for example. And most native plants evolve and adapt much more slowly than invasive plants do. And so what that means is that an invasive plant that's getting established might leaf out earlier in the spring and overshadow the native plants that are trying to leaf out in its shade. It might bloom earlier because it's leafing out earlier in response to our earlier springs. And by blooming earlier, it's going to attract the pollinators. more robustly than, say, our native plants. And so invasives have a natural ability to be environmentally flexible, and climate change is going to provide invasives with more opportunities to invade and overpower our native plants. And so it's important to not choose invasives, and then if you have invasives in your garden, to think about how to eliminate them. So here's a question of, not really a philosophical question, but it's phrased like one, and that is, to lawn or not to lawn? A lawn, an expanse of grass in and of itself is not a horrible thing for the climate, because it is biomass. It does have roots that are helping the soil store carbon. But it requires a lot of inputs that are not climate friendly at all. Lawns require a lot of water. They require often taken care of with powered equipment. They require fertilizer and sometimes pesticides to look their best. And so better choices for lawns are to choose low maintenance turf varieties and to consider planting native ground covers instead. Those are more climate friendly choices than to have a traditional lawn. If you want to have a lawn for kids to play on or for other reasons, then another option is to let it go brown in the summer and not water it and not mow it. It'll come back usually in the fall. So that's just a little bit on lawns. So in summary, for the helpful plant section of this talk, you can see that the adage to choose a helpful plant covered quite a lot of different categories of plants that we consider to be helpful in the context of climate smart gardening. I want to briefly touch on just a few more points before wrapping it up and taking some questions. And that is that we want to be carbon conscious in the way that we take care of our landscapes. We want to reduce as much as we can the equipment use that's powered by fossil fuels, and to use hand power whenever we can. We want to choose non-synthetic products for our gardens, that is to reduce synthetic pesticides and synthetic fertilizers, because they are manufactured with a base of fossil fuels, and also they require fossil fuels energy to manufacture, package, and transport. We want to keep our plant and food waste as local as we can. We want to compost our plant waste from our yards and our kitchen waste, either in our own compost piles or in our green bins, where the green waste goes to be composted in a relatively local facility. So keeping our plant and food waste local is the first kind of leg of this strategy. The thing we want to do at all costs is to keep our plant and food waste out of the garbage, because if it's in the garbage, it's going to go to the landfill. And if it goes to the landfill, it's going to be decomposing anaerobically, that is without oxygen in the landfill setting. And when organic matter decomposes without oxygen, it produces methane. And methane is a super potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. So we want to keep our organic wastes out of the landfill. The other thing you need to do, if you have a lawn and you're mowing your grass, leave those grass clippings in place. If your fall leaf layer is not too thick or too flammable, think about mulching those, just leaving those in place to mulch. And so these are practices which are going to provide local organic matter, number one, for building healthy soil, which we started with, but number two, it's a climate smart strategy. And recycling. A number of us are familiar with using recycled materials, both to plant starts and in our landscapes to repurpose materials. It's fun to do. It prevents us from having to spend money on new materials that have to be manufactured and transported, usually with a base of a fossil fuel economy. Propagating our own plants is another recycling strategy. Seed saving is great because when you choose seeds from the plants that did the best in your garden, those seeds are adapted to your own garden. The same thing with propagating cuttings. It's adapted to your own garden. Not only that, it's free. So that's always a great strategy. We started by talking about assessing our garden conditions, and we need to finish by monitoring our garden. That helps us close the circle. How are our plants doing? Going out frequently and inspecting, looking for new pests, figuring out what's thriving, what's not, what's wilting, and that just helps us have a healthier garden. And so monitoring our gardens is especially important in the face of maybe some less predictable conditions that are coming down the pike in the face of climate change. So here's what we've covered in terms of climate change adaptation strategies for climate smart gardens. And I'm gonna take, Barbara and I are gonna take a few questions. And Barbara, do you already have some questions people have asked in the chat?
We don't have any questions.
Okay.
No new one.
If anybody has a question, feel free to take yourself off of mute and just go ahead and ask. And in the meanwhile, I'm going to put up these resources and references just in case you're interested. And in a couple of minutes, I'm going to put up the last slide, which has some Master Gardener specific references. So any questions? Okay, hearing none. These are the ways to get in touch with us at the Marin Master Gardeners. The website has tons of great information. You can reach the best way to reach our help desk these days is by email, because we don't have Master Gardeners in the office. We're staffing our help desk remotely. And I see Barbara's hand. No, I didn't see Barbara's hand. We have a free newsletter called The Leaflet that actually we're emailing it now more frequently than quarterly. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, our Garden Walks is a free home visit program for water conservation and water-wise and climate-wise plants. So thank you so much. I'll stick around for just another couple minutes if you're too shy to ask your question in front of everybody, and maybe Barbara and I can, we'll be happy to chat with you as folks are logging off. So thanks so much for coming today.